Okay, thank you all for coming today. I'm Andrew Parasiliti. I'm president of Al-Monitor. And this is, for me personally and for Al-Monitor, a special event. I have known and admired Bill for several decades now as we've interacted with each other over the course of his career and followed what he's done and his huge impact on U.S. foreign policy. It's really wonderful to have you here. I thought what we do today is his book, The Back Channel, is a must read. I mean, this was one of those things where you pre-order it, it goes to the top of your stack of books, whatever you're reading, and it's worth it. It's not only an insider account of some of the most important developments in U.S. foreign policy, including in the Middle East and worldwide, but it is also a candid, reflective memoir of one of our finest, most distinguished diplomats of any time. There's no score settling. There's none of the usual cliches and platitudes. Bill tells you how it happened, where he was, and his positions. His analysis at the time, when you go back and read it, was so often spot on, and his diplomatic efforts really unmatched in terms of how he engaged people around the world. I know in my limited experience dealing in the Middle East and elsewhere, foreign leaders, members of Congress, people across Republican and Democrat administrations all have the highest admiration for Bill. And again, it's a pleasure to have you here. So thank you for coming.
It's great to be with you, Andrew, and great to be with all of you. After an introduction like that, this is the moment when I should walk off stage and just keep going. So that's very kind.
Well, look, I want to get right into it. There's so much in the book we can talk about. And I thought what we'd do is reflect on some of your comments in the book, and then, lead into some of the discussion of what's happening today. And let's start with Iran. You say in the book, Iran is hung over your career. And I'm going to read from just a couple of sentences from your section on the JCPOA. We could have done a better job, both before and after the comprehensive nuclear agreement was reached, of confronting the wider challenge of Iran in the Middle East. A willingness to take more risks against the Assad regime after the Syrian civil war began in 2011 would have sent a strong signal to Iran and cushioned this quieting effect of the nuclear deal for the Saudis and our other traditional friends. And it certainly would have helped shield the JCPOA from Trump's decision to withdraw. If we had been able to anchor it better politically at home, it would have been harder to undo a formal treaty than an executive agreement. Tell us a little about your experiences. You worked directly, negotiated with the Iranians, your experience and where we are now.
Well, again, it's great to be with all of you. Yeah, I mean, you're right. As I wrote in the book, Iran, in a way, for me and for lots of people in my generation, some of whom are in this room and the Foreign Service, Iran was an issue that sort of hung over my career. I mean, I took the written exam for the Foreign Service. I was a graduate student in England at the time, the same week as Iranian revolutionaries took over our embassy in Tehran and took my future colleagues hostage. So I suppose that should have been a signal to me about the Foreign Service. But, then I served through the 1980s, the horrific war between Iraq and Iran. I was on my first tour in Jordan when our embassy in Beirut was bombed by Iranian-supported extremists, and dozens of our colleagues were killed. I was working at the NSC staff. I'd actually just started working there when the Iran-Contra affair broke. Now, more than 30 years ago, it seems like, and in some ways it is ancient history, but another episode in which Iran hung over American foreign policy and almost undid a presidency. So, in many ways, Iran was a minefield in American foreign policy, and nobody had a good map for the minefield. I was always a believer through the course of my career that we ought to test the one thing we really hadn't tested in any systematic way, which is direct diplomacy with the Iranians, not out of any naive notion that we were going to transform the relationship, but simply because I believed that that was an important element in managing a problem, not necessarily solving it, because the nature of the theocratic regime in Iran is such that I just didn't think there were either going to be grand bargains on the one hand, nor did I think regime change made any sense, especially given our track record in the Middle East. And so, late in the George W. Bush administration, when I had come back from Moscow as ambassador, I was the number 3 position in the State Department. I was a pest with Secretary Rice and with the White House. And and it didn't need much pushing with Condi Rice at the time. And then in the summer of 2008, for the first time, the United States, I joined what became the P5+1 nuclear negotiations with the Iranians in Geneva that summer. Then came the Obama administration with a much more ambitious view of testing the proposition of direct engagement with Iran on the nuclear issue, which was only one of a number of ways in which Iranian actions threatened or potentially threatened American interests. But it was in some ways, I always thought, the most immediate source of problems in a region which had more than its share of problems at that point. So we spent the first term, President Obama's first term, essentially testing the proposition that direct diplomacy with Iran, working with our international partners, might produce something on the nuclear issue. But not only was it a test, it was also an investment in building a wider coalition of countries, because if it turned out that the Iranians weren't at that moment prepared to negotiate seriously on the nuclear issue, we could then pivot and having invested in an effort at direct diplomacy, we couldn't be blamed for hanging back from diplomacy to turn that into what became a significant Security Council resolution 1929 in June of 2010. And to make a long story short, by the beginning of Obama's second term, Iran's oil exports had dropped by 50% as a result of international sanctions. The value of its currency had dropped by 50%. And the minds of the Iranian regime, I think at that point, were focused. That was necessary, but not sufficient. What that had to be coupled with was a renewed effort at direct engagement. And that's what led to, the back channel negotiations with the Iranians through almost all of 2013. Most of the 9 or 10 sessions we had were in Oman. The Omanis were quite skillful facilitators of those negotiations. It surprises me to this day that we kept it quiet as long as we did. There were some journalists, I don't know if Laura Rosen is here, but who became aware of this near the end of that time. But it was for a reason, and it was not an easy call for President Obama to conduct this initial phase of negotiations quietly, because obviously it's deeply uncomfortable when you're not sharing that information from the very start with some of our closest partners. I think it was the right call, simply because given the amount of baggage on both sides in Washington and Tehran, I think it would have been very difficult to make the progress that we ultimately did had we tried to conduct that initial phase of negotiations in the glare of publicity and under intense scrutiny. But it was a hard thing to pull off at that time. So that's the backdrop anyway.
And what about today? I mean, you've negotiated directly with the Iranians. You see they're
Most of my gray hair came from that, yeah.
And Rouhani, President Rouhani, Foreign Minister Zarif are up at UN denying their involvement in the attack on Saudi Arabia when the British, the French, and the Germans just released a statement implicating them. Is it possible at this stage to deal with Iran? And what were the lessons you learned as a diplomat and for U.S. policy and direct engagement with them?
Well, I mean, I think, the Trump administration has experimented over, especially since, May of last year when President Trump decided to abandon the comprehensive nuclear agreement, which I thought was a foolish mistake and continue to think is a foolish mistake, has experimented with the notion that you can engage in a kind of coercive diplomacy, which is all coercion and no diplomacy. And I don't think that works. I mean, in the sense that what I think President Trump has tried to do is employ what he's termed maximum pressure. And we can certainly, the United States, whether our allies like it or not, and they don't like it, can impose enormous economic costs on the Iranian regime. And we have over more than a year. The problem is that unless maximum, in my view, is that unless maximum pressure is tethered to realistic aims and a willingness ultimately to engage in what is inevitably the give and take of serious diplomacy, you end up in a situation that leads to explosions of one kind or another, and where you get mutual enablers on both sides. And there's no shortage of, I hate the term hardliners, but hardliners in both Tehran and Washington who can enable each other up a very shaky escalatory ladder very quickly. I don't think, ironically, in a way, that either leadership right now is looking for a full-on military conflict. But, you know, as many of you know better than I do, the Middle East is the land of unintended consequences, and you can easily back yourself into collisions which are very difficult to get out of. I wish I had a magic formula for how you de-escalate this situation. I mean, I think there are several elements that would be worth exploring. One, since I'm based only on what I read in the newspapers, believe that the Iranians are responsible for the attacks on the Saudi oil facilities, notwithstanding the denials that Iran has officially made. The problem for the United States is that our credibility is quite low in this era. And so, you know, getting the UN to do an investigation over 90 days or so is actually not a bad way to buy some time to de-escalate. I think the conclusions of a fair investigation would be pretty clear. I think you'd want to couple that with a serious effort to deal with what is a catastrophic situation in Yemen, and which is one of the contributing causes to the crisis that we see today. The Houthis, whether sincerely or insincerely, have recently talked about a ceasefire. It seems to me that one of the priorities in American foreign policy ought to be to push our friends in Saudi Arabia quite hard toward a similar kind of offer, because I think otherwise Yemen is not only continues to be a humanitarian catastrophe, but is going to increasingly be a strategic catastrophe for Saudi Arabia in particular, as well as for Yemen and the people of Yemen as well. And there too, I think, you know, it'd be a smart thing for the Saudis to get up on the high ground in a sense, especially while you're launching an investigation into what I believe is Iranian culpability in the reckless attacks on Saudi Arabia. And then third, I think you'd want to explore some version of what President Macron has tried to explore, which is buy some time in which both the United States and Iran in particular agree, at least implicitly, not to make things worse than they already are. So not adding new sanctions, not adding new military deployments on the US side, and the Iranians at least tacitly committing, you know, not to engage in further provocative acts in the Gulf, and not to continue to edge away from the nuclear agreement. All that does is buy you some time. You'd have to stretch out that time, you know, to create the possibility of direct talks by considering some form of limited and temporary economic relief for Iran, because short of that, I think you're going to continue to see provocations from Iran, whether that's Macron's idea of some kind of a, you know, short-term line of credit, which the United States would have to at least, you know, indirectly facilitate through exemptions or short-term exemptions or waivers, I don't know. All of that is infinitely easier said than done. It's a kind of issue that keeps my nostalgia for government service under control, because, you know, right now I think the Iranians are tempting fate. I think they're tempted to overreach. I think they read, so far at least, in President Trump's you know, lack of a direct military response. Rightly or wrongly, they become convinced that he's bluffing. And you know, I don't think they're very attracted to the idea of, you know, a spectacle, a meeting between President Trump and Rouhani. I think the President Trump, I think, has misread the Iranians a little bit. They're not Kim Jong-un. You know, they're not, in my experience, attracted to spectacles. What they're seeking is some form of economic relief. And that's what maximum pressure, in a sense, missed. I think the notion that through coercive actions alone, as powerful as they have been and can be, you can, in a sense, cause this Iranian regime to either capitulate or implode. I don't think those are realistic aims. And the Iranians get a vote in this too. And they are going to continue to push back and provoke, I think, unless some kind of a diplomatic pathway emerges. And as I said, that's going to be much easier said than done.
Thank you. Wanted to mention your experience with Vladimir Putin and how this might inform
the other part of my gray hair. Yeah.
inform some of our policies in the region. You write here, Putin's most striking characteristic was his passion for control, founded on an abiding distrust of those around him, whether in the Russian elite or among foreign leaders. And then you go on to describe his background. And you were ambassador to Russia. You'd served there previously, and then in your subsequent posts, encountered Russia and Putin on many occasions. Tell me how you see the U.S. relationship with Russia. I should add, we bring this up, Al Monitor is, of course, Middle East, but those who are your readers know we have our Russia Pulse, which covers Russia's engagement with the Middle East. So this is something we track quite closely. And what it means, we talked about Syria. I read the quote about Syria. Do you think there's something that could be worked out with Putin in Syria, elsewhere in the region? How do you see Putin's ambitions there, and what was your experience with him?
Sure. Well, maybe first a little bit about Putin and my experience with Putin's Russia, and then a little bit about Russia and the Middle East, both complicated questions. I mean, Putin himself, in my experience, is a very combustible combination of grievance and ambition and insecurity all wrapped together. And it's not unique to Vladimir Putin. It's true of a lot of people in the Russian political elite, given their historical experience. I vividly remember my first meeting with Putin when I was the newly arrived American ambassador in Moscow. This is August 2005. So the meeting takes place in the Kremlin, which, as many of you know, is a place that's built on a scale that's meant to intimidate visitors, especially newly arrived American ambassadors. So, you know, you come in, you walk through these huge ornate halls, down long corridors. You come to the end of one huge hall under these 2-story bronze doors, and you're kept waiting there for a little bit just to let all this sink in. Then the doors crack open a little bit, out comes President Putin, who, despite his bare-chested persona, is not all that intimidating in the flesh. He's about 5'6", even with lifts in his shoes. But he carries himself with great self-assurance. So he comes walking through the door, looking you dead in the eye, which is his wont. And I remember before I got a word out of my mouth, him saying, "You Americans need to listen more. You can't have everything you want anymore. We can have effective relations, but not just on your terms." In my experience, that was vintage Vladimir Putin. It was not subtle. It was almost defiantly charmless. But the message was Putin's Russia, surfing at that point on, $110 a barrel oil, was going to push back. And I've always thought of Putin a little bit as a kind of apostle of payback. And so his conviction, rightly or wrongly, is that the United States and the West took advantage of Russia's moment of historical weakness in the 1990s. So, he drew a straight line from that through the color revolutions in Georgia in 2003, Ukraine 2004, saw the purpose of American policy, I think largely without foundation, as keeping Russia down. And so when he saw an opportunity in our election in 2016 to take advantage of our political dysfunction, he leapt at the opportunity. He's, the ultimate cynic in some ways, in the sense that I think he is all about control at home. He fundamentally does distrust, I think, his own political elite and his own citizenry. He's certainly smart enough to understand that Russia's playing a weaker hand than the United States or China today, with huge demographic problems, a one-dimensional economy, a military that's modernized, but still not a competitor for the United States or even China today, except in the nuclear field. But he's tactically very agile. So where he sees opportunities, he's been quite quick and oftentimes quite artful in seizing them, hence the Middle East and Syria. I mean, if you added up everything that the United States did in the Obama administration between 2011 and, say, the end of 2014 in Syria, cumulatively, it's actually pretty impressive in terms of supporting what was originally at least a moderate opposition. But we did it so grudgingly and incrementally that it never had much diplomatic impact, let alone impact on the ground. What Putin did in September of 2015 was to telescope Russian intervention. So he took a relatively modest military intervention, 36 attack aircraft, no more than a couple thousand, Russian military personnel on the ground, but did it in a decisive, telescoped way to have maximum diplomatic impact. And I think, for Russia, for Putin, this was an opportunity. He saw an opening created in part, I think, by American mistakes, but just in larger part by the chaos and dysfunction and brutality of the situation. And without any sentimental attachment to Bashar al-Assad, saw an opportunity to expand Russian influence and play a kind of disproportionately large diplomatic role. I think I wish I could be more optimistic about the future of Syria. I think what Bashar al-Assad and his incredibly thuggish regime have done is essentially to destroy their country and their society in order to preserve, what is in effect a kind of mafia clan at the top of that regime right now. I think the Russians, don't have identical interests to Iran, the other principal outside backer of the Assad regime. But, they share a common interest right now in propping up Assad, as well, I think, at least in the Russian case, in ensuring against the kind of escalation that can create greater complications, whether it's between Israel and Iran, Turkey and the Kurds, or anything else. And so, from Putin's point of view, at a manageable, relatively modest level of investment in Syria, with a totally unprincipled and oftentimes brutal view of what it takes to succeed in Syria, has managed to carve out a space for Russia, not just in Syria, but in the Middle East, which is in some ways at least as significant as the Soviet Union's position in the Middle East decades ago. The artful part of Russian diplomacy is that, as unprincipled in a way as it can be, it is artful in the sense the Russians have lines open to just about every player in the Middle East today. They've managed to keep effective, if not totally trusting, lines open to some of our closest partners in the Gulf, notwithstanding the actions that they've taken in Syria. And so, for the time being, and at least for the foreseeable future, I think the Russians are a central player diplomatically in the Middle East. And in Syria, certainly have higher cards to play than we do right now.
How does Putin take advantage of the situation with Iran right now?
Well, in the short term, so, what I believe were Iranian attacks on Saudi oil facilities caused a temporary spike in oil prices. Bless you. That benefits, that benefits the Russians. As I said, they're kind of shackled to a one-dimensional economy right now. Putin could have diversified that economy, especially a decade ago. I remember when I was ambassador, when he, was, kind of benefiting from very high hydrocarbon prices. He chose not to, again, because that would have come at the expense of political control, what matters most. So he benefited in the short run from that. I think his view is that he's positioned Russia, much like the Chinese have positioned themselves, to take advantage of, whether there's an escalating crisis, but they take advantage of the ways in which I think we, the United States, have isolated ourselves, in a sense, on diplomacy on the Iran issue right now, too. So it's not that the Russians have any particular interest in an escalation of the crisis. I don't think they do. But they've positioned themselves to take advantage of this whichever way it goes.
I turn to Iraq, and what I find one of the more interesting passages, because it gets his role as a diplomat and a senior policy official. At the end of that, this chapter on the age of terror, you say, in thinking back on Iraq, you say there was all too often a massive disconnect between bold pronouncements in the cloistered Situation Room and the messy challenge of connecting them to the realities of the Middle East. And then there were the more elusive sins of omission. Some were deeply personal, having tried to highlight all the things that could go wrong, all the unanswered strategic and practical questions, and all the flaws in going it alone. Why didn't I go to the mat in my opposition or quit? These are hard decisions filled with professional, moral, and family considerations. So could you reflect first on that kind of reflection about, you had serious questions about Iraq, the memos and the analysis you presented, and anticipating the consequences were pretty much in line with what happened. But you continued in your senior policymaking role. Share a little more about your thoughts at that time, then maybe we can talk about where Iraq is today.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, to this day, I'm not sure. I'm certainly not sure I got it right. Either in terms of my analysis of what was unfolding at the time, and several of my colleagues from that era, from the Near East Bureau in that era, are with us in this room today. Our analyses, we tried to be honest about our concerns. I remember probably the most depressing brainstorming session of my 3.5 decades as an American diplomat was one afternoon in the summer of 2002, I think, when Ryan Crocker, who was one of my deputies, against his better judgment, actually serving in Washington for a couple of years, and David Pierce, another wonderful Foreign Service officer who had been a entering Foreign Service classmate of mine many years ago. We sat down and, based on a draft that David had originally done, tried to think through everything that we thought at least could go wrong after an American military toppling of Saddam Hussein. Because I don't mean to minimize the military challenge, because there were a lot of uncertainties then, but I always thought that was going to be the easy part, in a sense. The hard part was always going to be what came after, especially in Iraq, as you know very well, Andrew, that, in which Saddam, in a brutally repressive regime, basically put a lid on, a lot of sectarian and all sorts of other kinds of differences within his own society. So what would happen when you took that lid off? So we wrote this memo, which we called The Perfect Storm, which was a reflection of the optimism with which we viewed this issue. And, you reread it years later, and we got it about half right. We got some things right in terms of the dangers of disorder, sectarian conflict afterwards. We got some things wrong, too, about the risk of Saddam using chemical weapons against American troops. I think we tried to highlight what the regional impact would be, the way in which you would, in a sense, especially after the toppling of the Taliban in Kabul a year or so earlier, how you would be, in a sense, opening the field for the expansion of Iranian influence as well. But that had no impact on the direction of policy, and we ended up going to war. It involves a difficult set of choices for any career officer, career diplomat as well. I have huge respect for people who chose to resign, whether it was the 3 or 4 of my colleagues in the State Department who resigned over Iraq and the war in 2003, or the 20-some who resigned earlier in the 1990s over the war in Bosnia and the Balkans as well, when they felt they couldn't, in good conscience, support American policies that they thought were deeply flawed. I think, I have equal respect for people who continue to serve, but with that continued service comes an obligation, and that obligation is to be honest about your concerns. The term "speak truth to power" is overused sometimes, but that's really what it involves. Because if you create a system in the State Department or any place else where people self-censor, feel intimidated, aren't going to be honest about concerns like that, it almost inevitably leads not just to bad policy choices and bad implementation of policies, but it can ruin morale in an institution as well. So to this day, I'm not sure that I got the balance right. But I do think, for all those who are continuing to serve in very difficult circumstances today, it's really important to be honest about your concerns within the system. You don't, if you choose to resign, that's an honorable course to take, and I have great admiration and respect, as I said before. You don't get to run out to, complain publicly in the New York Times about policies if you want to stay in the service. But you do have an obligation to be honest within the system about your concerns, however inconvenient that may be to whomever the powers that be are.
In Iraq today, do you feel it's turning a corner?
Yeah, I mean, compared to what the situation was in the first few years after the war in 2003, I, like many of my colleagues here, lived through that and saw it, and saw the depths to which people in that society could sink. So by contrast to that period, I think things are pointed in a much healthier direction. I think you have a solid leadership in Baghdad right now, with a very complicated set of problems to deal with. It's a balancing act, between a relationship with the United States and managing a relationship with their big, complicated neighbor to the east, as well as with Gulf Arab countries, some of which I think were slow to understand that if you wanted to compete effectively with Iran and Iraq, it helped to invest in stability in Iraq as well. But I think that's something that's better understood amongst Gulf Arab states today. So yeah, I'm certainly more optimistic than I was a few years ago. But it's going to be a slow, complicated path. And I think it is important for the United States not only to learn from our mistakes in the past, but to continue to focus attention and energy on Iraq's future as well. Because not only is it in our strategic interest to do that, I think we have an obligation as well, given what came before 15 years ago.
Great. Well, thank you. The floor is now open for questions. If you could keep the questions reasonably brief so we can get in as many as possible in the short time we have. Do we have someone that's coming around, Cooper, with the microphone? So, sir, question right there. And if you could identify yourself, please, name and affiliation.
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. My name is Edward Joseph with Johns Hopkins SAIS.
Hi.
Ambassador Burns, it's often said to military folks, thank you for your service, but I think we can all say to you, thank you for your service.
Thanks.
And thank you, Andrew and Ambassador Burns, for being here this morning. I'd like to, if I could, drill down a little deeper in your point about Iran and why you believe it would be so difficult to achieve some breakthrough with Iran. After all, they're under intense pressure, which you say they want relief. After this statement by the Europeans, they're now increasingly isolated. They may believe Trump is bluffing, but they can't really count on that. After all, he bombed twice in Syria when Obama wouldn't. The Israelis have bombed repeatedly in Syria as well. So, and plus, the offer of negotiation is there. It may be spectacle, but obviously a more serious forum could be developed. There's Brian Hook has been talking for months with the European counterparts. So why do you believe that this is so far-fetched, that there could be a breakthrough that would get a better deal? Thank you.
I don't think it's far-fetched. I mean, I do think it's very difficult. And I think of all the ingredients, I think the ingredients you described are exactly right. I think the missing ingredient, it seems to me, is, to begin to address in some fashion one of the reasons that the Iranians, since May of 2018 and our withdrawal from the nuclear agreement, have been so provocative. And that's because they're looking for some form of economic relief. So, I think you take all the ingredients that you mentioned, and that gives the United States a fair amount of leverage. I agree with you. I think what you would have to add to that to have a serious hope of getting any place is some version of what Macron, has proposed, whether it's a line of credit over a limited period of time or something else. I'm not saying that that has to be the first card that you play, but I think in order to sustain, a lot of diplomacy is buying time and space for negotiations so that you prevent things from getting worse in the meantime. And I just think that's an ingredient that you'd have to insert in there someplace too. So I don't think it's impossible. Don't get me wrong. And that's the challenge of statecraft and of diplomacy in a way. But again, you can succeed in coercive diplomacy. And I think in a way, that's what we did, in the last administration in producing the nuclear agreement. Neither the Iranians nor we were very sentimental about those negotiations. But we had built a fair amount of leverage. And a lot of that was international as opposed to just unilateral. But then you got to use that leverage, and that's where diplomacy comes in too. So I think as long as we found some creative way working with the Europeans to insert at some point early in this phase some potential for limited economic relief, then I think you might have a winning hand diplomatically.
question over here, Rick. If you could identify yourself, please.
Sure. Rick Olson, retired FSO.
Hi, Rick.
Hi, Bill. Thanks very much for doing this. I guess I wanted to come back to this question again on Iran, of the passage that Andrew read, in which you expressed some regret about maybe not doing more political outreach, during that period. But it seems to me that there is, underlying our policy then and now, there's this question of whether or not to pursue a grand bargain. And that was, it seems to me, in the context of when the JCPOA was developed, that was the essential issue that many critiqued, that it didn't address questions of Iranian missiles or the regional dimension. And bringing it back up to where we are now, it seems that this policy of maximum pressure seems designed to pursue some kind of grand bargain.
Right.
And as certainly our Gulf allies, UAE and Saudi, would push us in that direction. I tend to think, like you, that a grand bargain is impossible. So is it possible to move forward, or is the best we can do with Iran a fairly narrow, circumscribed set of discussions?
Well, no, it's a really good question. I mean, my view always was, and the passage that Andrew read, I'm a realist, and of course, we could have anchored the Comprehensive Nuclear Agreement more solidly if it was a treaty, passed by the U.S. Senate. But I'll let Andrew comment on this. I don't think there was a chance in hell that was going to happen. Of course, especially in hindsight, and it's amazing how much smarter we all get after we leave government. Had we taken, some actions in Syria early on in the civil war, it wouldn't, I think, have produced a military solution in Syria or necessarily the military overthrow of the Assad regime. It might have empowered our diplomacy, arguably, a little better. And it might have sent a signal to others in the region on other issues like Iran that there were circumstances under which we'd use force in defense of our interests. Whether it was in a much more complicated case of Syria or in the case of Iran that clearly was trying to develop nuclear weapons as well. So who knows, but I don't mean to suggest that those were easy things to accomplish at the time. I always thought of the JPOA, the interim agreement that we reached at the end of 2013 after the secret talks, and then the Comprehensive Nuclear Agreement. They were meant, in my view, to be the beginning of diplomacy, not the end of it. In other words, it was the most, in my view, that we could achieve at that moment. But as we indicated to the Iranians, even going back to the back channel talks, like any arms control process, like we used to do with the Soviets and then the Russians, you build on that over time. So you're going to address issues using that foundation of extending timelines on certain of the constraints on the Iranian nuclear program. That we clearly had concerns about Iranian ballistic missile development we'd want to address. We clearly had deep differences over Iran's behavior and the actions that they took in the region to subvert some of their neighbors as well. If I thought we could have achieved a grand bargain then, or if I thought we could achieve it today, I'd be all for it. I don't think that's practical given the nature of this Iranian regime, given the differences between us right now. I always am careful about historical analogies, but in some ways the kind of containment doctrine that George Kennan, invented in some ways, and that we pursued with regard to the Soviet Union, which was a global competitor. I'm not trying to suggest Iran is a global competitor, it's a regional competitor. But some of the same lessons, I think, can be drawn in the sense that that was based on an understanding that you needed to limit the dangers posed by that regime through a combination of engagement and arms control agreements to limit nuclear dangers, pushing back on regional behavior by the Soviets at the height of the Cold War in a lot of different parts of the world, being honest about human rights concerns in the Soviet Union, just as we should be honest and public about concerns about human rights abuses inside Iran. But based on a certain amount of confidence that the internal contradictions in that society, not least the reality that a very young population, 70% of which is under the age of 30 today, thirst for connections with the rest of the world, that this regime over time is not going to be able to provide or answer, at least under its current leadership. And therefore, the notion was that you can limit the dangers in the short term. You have to work with allies and partners to push back. But over time, you're playing a better hand. And of all the possibilities before us, I thought a decade ago, and I think today, that in some ways is the most practical of the available approaches. It's not a soft view of Iran. I think it's a very hard-nosed view of the challenge that Iran poses. But it's the way in which you use diplomacy backed up by military and economic leverage and working with lots of others. And that's where I think the kind of unilateralist impulse of this administration on this issue and on a lot of issues it helps us get in our own way sometimes too. So again, I always thought of the nuclear agreement, the comprehensive agreement, as the beginning, not the end of diplomacy.
Marcel, question right here.
Thank you. Marcel Wahba,
Hey,
also
Marcel.
retired FSL. Hi, Bill. Thank you very much for the session today. I want to, again, focus on Iran, but maybe think about it from the Arab Gulf states perspective. Not only was this administration unhappy with the lack of the political dimension in the JCPOA, but so were the Gulf Arab states. And while they supported this maximum pressure and the pulling out of the agreement by the Trump administration, I think there was also very deep concern now when they see the real example of what asymmetrical warfare can do in the region to their well-being. So I'm struggling with the fact that we don't seem to have enough diplomatic effort in the region to lower the tension between the players in the region. I keep thinking that the US has a lot of sway on Saudi Arabia and on the UAE, and why is there not a more robust diplomatic effort, for example, to focus on how the Saudis can get out of Yemen,
Right.
and how the Iranians could show goodwill by at least, I mean, not that they're in total control of the Houthis, but they have a huge influence on the Houthis. Why can't the US play a bigger role in a way to get the players in the region to lower the tensions so that those tensions that come out of the region don't inflame the US-Iran situation?
I mean, Marcel, you know as well as anyone that is the traditional approach that the United States would make in a circumstance like this. Now, we didn't always get it right in the past. We oftentimes got it wrong. But that's the role of the United States. And what it means, in a sense, is that healthy relationships, even with our closest partners in the Gulf, have to be two-way streets. And I understand all the grievance that a lot of our closest partners have about American policy over the last 10 years. But we ought to be honest with people, in a sense, to be practical about it with the current Saudi leadership, that, we will be enthusiastic supporters of efforts at economic and social modernization and reform, Vision 2030. That's a very sensible outline, at least, of where we, as a friend of Saudi Arabia, should want that society to go. We'll have Saudi Arabia's back against legitimate external threats, whether it's the Iranians or anybody else. So this administration is demonstrating that with some of the, recent announcements by the Pentagon. But we will also be equally honest where we have concerns about overreach, whether it's external overreach in Yemen. We're not doing any favors to Saudi Arabia by not being honest about that. And we ought to back that up privately and ultimately publicly, if necessary, by trying to push very hard, as I mentioned in my earlier comments, for the Saudis to take a step toward a ceasefire right now. This is not going to end well otherwise. And I don't think the United States gets very far by being indulgent on issues like this. And I think the same thing about internal overreach. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi in a Saudi diplomatic facility in Istanbul. That it's a huge mistake for the United States on an issue like that to check our values at the door, which is in effect what we've done. I understand the argument, and you and I and Rick and Tom and lots of others in this room have wrestled with this over the years. The concern is always that you have a relationship where you have a lot at stake and you have short-term counter-terrorist cooperation and this and that, and you're balancing that against, how direct you should be on those concerns. So I don't underestimate the difficulties of the diplomacy involved. I just think at the end of the day that indulging a partner like that on issues like this is going to create a more brittle relationship over time, and a less solid partnership. So I think you're exactly right on Yemen. I think, the Emirati leadership, from my impression from the outside over the last 6 months, has recognized a lot of the problems that you just described. I think correctly anticipated, the kind of crisis that we've seen right now, what happens, when you end up in a situation where it's very hard to control escalation. And so I think that's why I think this is the moment, getting back to the earlier question, as difficult as this is, you want to, in a weird way, take advantage of this crisis diplomatically and see if you can't use the leverage we have now, what I believe is Iranian responsibility for these attacks, to make a much more serious push on ending the war in Yemen, and to begin a process where you can create some time and space to start talking, difficult as it is, with the Iranians about lowering tensions in the Gulf and seeing if we can't find some pathway back to a nuclear agreement, and begin talking about ways in which over time you could strengthen it as well. That's the only formula that I can think of right now that offers a pathway out of what I fear is otherwise going to be a continued escalation.
I've got a question over here. Yes, in the front.
William Breed, Dining Group International. Bill, could the IRGC have carried out the Aramco attacks without the knowledge of Rouhani and the approval of Khamenei?
Again, I'm basing this only on what I read in the newspapers, but it's very hard for me to imagine that the Supreme Leader wouldn't have been aware of and approved of an action like that.
It's a question right here.
Good morning, Ambassador. My name is Charles Tepo. As you can guess it, I'm French. And I'm a visiting fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. My question is, how do you see the future of US involvement in the Middle East in the 5 to 10 years? We've heard or we've read tweets from the president that US security had a price and was in some ways transactional, but also under the Obama administration, we had a feeling that Gulf countries should take care of their own security. So there is also a trend beside difference in policies and style. But at the same time, the recent attacks in Saudi Arabia have shown that some other actors are going to fill the gap. So how do you see these two things evolving together, and how the US government should do to combine all these challenges?
Yeah. I come back to my point about keeping my nostalgia under control about government service, because, we're in a really complicated period of transition, I think, in terms of America's role and strategy in the Middle East. And this goes back to, the Obama administration and the legacy, the shadow that the war in Iraq in 2003 kind of cast over America's involvement in the Middle East. And so what I thought President Obama was trying to do is not so much disengage from the Middle East. That was the stock criticism of the Obama administration. But it was certainly to change the terms of engagement of the United States involvement in the Middle East from what I believe was an over-militarized, approach to the Middle East after 2003 to an era in which we still have a profound stake, whether we like it or not, in stability or some semblance of it in the Middle East. We're not so directly dependent on hydrocarbons from the Gulf as we were 20 or 30 years ago. But those hydrocarbons still matter a lot to the global economy, and that matters to the United States. So it's not as if we have the luxury of ignoring what happens in the Middle East, but I do think it's right that we need to change the terms of engagement and emphasize more, diplomacy backed up by military and economic leverage, reinvest in partnerships. So as I was trying to say in response to the earlier question, that they're healthier two-way streets, not to lose sight of some of the deeper drivers of dysfunction across the Middle East, and in particular the Arab world, because a lot of the indignities that gave rise to the Arab Spring and the Arab revolts now 8 years ago are still bubbling, and they're going to bubble back across the surface unless leaderships and societies begin to address them, to pay attention to the extent we as an outside power can, to limit the dangers of escalation in the region, because as our European allies know all too well, they tend to spill over. The old Las Vegas maxim that, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas doesn't apply to the Middle East. What happens there tends to spill over into other parts of the world. So we, the United States, does have a role to play working with allies and partners to limit those dangers of spillover and escalation. Over time, that does involve, I think, both pushing back against Iranian threatening behavior in the region, but also over time pushing our partners like in Saudi Arabia to understand that Iran's not going anyplace, and sooner or later, if Iran tempers its behavior, and that's a big if, the only hope you have for some semblance of order in the region is going to be a world in which, even though they may not like each other, they may not trust each other, there's some basic rules of the road amongst the sort of major regional players as well. So again, as I said earlier, a lot easier said than done, but I think what's complicated is that this is a period of transition in terms of American strategy in the Middle East. I didn't mention the Palestinian issue. That issue, I believe it's also a mistake for us not to pay attention to. The conflict between Israelis and Arabs and Israelis and Palestinians as well. But what is especially complicated about this era, what was especially complicated, I think, in some ways for all of us in the Obama administration, is that even as we try to change the terms of engagement in a way, we live in a world in which many of our closest partners in the region, as well as our adversaries, have assumed a lot about American centrality in their world. And probably have exaggerated, much as we did, our agency, our influence over choices that people in the region make. And I think it turned out to be a lot more complicated than we thought to sort of manage that disengagement. And I think the Trump administration, in a much different way, is discovering that as well. So it's going to be a complicated task, and it's going to be the task not just of the rest of this administration and the next one, but the one after that probably as well.
Adam?
Hey. Sure.
Could you talk a little bit about Jordan, sort of one of your favorite places? And the question is this: Jordan's obituary has been written many, many times,
right,
but it's still there. How would you assess Jordan's long-term stability given the demographic issues, the social issues, and the economic issues?
Sure. Well, I mean, first, in terms of obituaries being written, there's a story that involved John Foster Dulles in the early 1950s when he's reporting back to President Eisenhower after an early meeting with King Hussein, and the very young and very new King of Jordan. And he reported back that, he was a very nice, impressive young man. It's just a shame his country's not going to last too long. Well, 60 some years later, I think Jordan is still a stable partner in the Middle East for the United States, a stable partner in a neighborhood not noted for its instability. But I don't underestimate the pressures that Jordan faces today. Economic pressures are obvious because while it may be rich in human resources, it's not rich in the other kind of resources that set many of its neighbors apart. And I do worry a little bit about, what the so-called deal of the century in this administration might mean for Jordan for the following reason. Who knows whether the political dimension of that deal of the century is ever going to become public. And first, I'm sure we'll have to see the face of the next Israeli government as well. What I fear, though, is that it's built on a lot of false assumptions. I mean, the false assumption first that you can promote peace by dealing over and around the Palestinian leadership. Second, that somehow you can use economic benefit to solve political problems. I think if the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict were a matter of dollars and cents, we'd have solved it a long time ago. Third, I think the illusion in some respects that time is on our side on this issue, which I think is a false assumption, in the sense that if you just look at demography, the reality as you play this out a decade or two is that, Arabs will be in the majority in the land that Israel controls from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. And it's hard to see how to sustain a Jewish democratic state in that kind of reality. And as a friend, as Israel's closest friend in the world, it just seems to me that the United States, ought to have that conversation. And that leads me to my point about Jordan, which is there's a false assumption, I think, that there's no significant collateral damage to the end of a two-state solution, which is in effect the kind of picture I'm painting. What I worry about, and you see this on the right in Israel sometimes, is that, if a two-state solution dies because it no longer looks practical, that you could have anything resembling an independent Palestinian state with all sorts of security constraints and everything else. Then on the right in Israel, I think you're going to see a resurrection of the notion about, okay, so how do you solve this conundrum? You export the problem on the other side of the Jordan River, and that's a huge challenge for Hashemite Jordan. So I'm not a pessimist about Jordan. Ever since John Foster Dulles' time, Jordanians, not just their leaderships, have proven that they're pretty resilient. And they've learned a lesson as they've looked to the north at what's happened in Syria. They don't want to repeat that experience. On the other hand, there are a lot of pressures right now, and I wouldn't underestimate, if you play out the so-called deal of the century, how that might compound some of those problems over time. And it just seems to me in Washington, people ought to be more concerned about that, because that, small, modest, but stable partner in a really complicated piece of geography matters a lot.
We have time for just one more question over here. Bill?
William Dartmouth Science.
Hey.
Well, I'll pick you up. I wanted to ask more about Yemen because I don't think it dealt with that question sufficiently. Yes. But the president said he's going to take on. The president said he's going to take on the question of Kashmir. He said that yesterday. Is this the time?
Yeah. I learned a lot of things as a diplomat, but on Kashmir, for American diplomats, first, Indians control their enthusiasm for American direct diplomatic engagement on that issue. And the president kind of stepped on that landmine when he made his initial public comments with the Prime Minister of Pakistan sitting next to him. I'm concerned about, the potential for escalation in Kashmir after the most recent decisions by the Indian government. I'm concerned about the penchant to the Pakistani government, or those in this room who know this better than I do, for supporting extremist groups, that carry out terrorist attacks outside of Pakistan. So I'm worried about the dangers of escalation. And I think one of the kind of potential crises in the world, which hasn't got the attention it's deserved in recent years, not just in this administration, but in some ways before that, is the danger of escalation between Pakistan and India. If you had a terrorist attack today that was a third the size of the Mumbai attack in 2008, you could be off to the races very quickly with two nuclear-armed states. Pakistan's continued investment in tactical nuclear weapons, everything from nuclear mines to, short-range nuclear weapons, in many ways both increases the threshold for use potentially, and it also increases the danger that bad people can get a hold of those systems. So I worry about not just about Kashmir, but about the potential for escalation between Pakistan and India. There are limits to what American diplomacy can do, but again, traditionally, the role of the United States is to try to quietly but persistently calm things down. And that's where you need not just empowered ambassadors in Islamabad and in New Delhi, but an administration that's going to focus and attach a fair amount of priority to those issues as well. We're in a solid position today in the sense that over the last 3 or 4 American administrations, we've built an important partnership with India. Prime Minister Modi and President Trump were just appearing before thousands in Texas. But I think, the Pakistani relationship remains important as well. And so we need to work both of those to help guard against the dangers of an escalation.
Well, Bill, thank you for your time today, for a remarkable and impactful career. Writing an amazing book I encourage you all to buy and read because it's first rate, and for maintaining the highest standards of service and to our government. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.